In organizational psychology, there is a recurring pattern observed in high accountability environments, legal interrogations, elite consulting firms, and even intimate relationships under strain. It appears in studies of conversational control without ever being formally labeled as one single phenomenon. A person asks a simple question. You answer it directly. But instead of resolution, you are met with a follow-up that reframes your answer as incomplete, imprecise, or insufficiently justified. So you add detail, then more detail, then justification for your detail. By the end, the original question has disappeared, replaced by your need to defend your own reasoning. What kind of psychological dynamic transforms a simple exchange of information into a quiet demand that you prove yourself? This pattern can be understood through what researchers in social cognition loosely describe as an interrogative dominance loop, a conversational structure where one participant unconsciously or deliberately controls the burden of explanation. It is not about asking many questions, it is about how questions are used to redistribute cognitive responsibility. Daniel Kahneman's dual process theory is relevant here. System 1 produces quick, coherent answers. System 2 constructs justification. In normal conversation, these systems cooperate. In this loop, System 2 is forcibly overactivated, not for clarity, but for validation. Robert Cialdini's principle of authority also plays a subtle role. When a questioner is perceived as more knowledgeable, their uncertainty feels like evidence of your inadequacy. By the end of this analysis, you will be able to recognize when conversation stops being inquiry and becomes a structure that extracts justification from you rather than understanding from you. Not every difficult conversation is manipulation, but some conversations are engineered, consciously or not, to make your confidence leak out through explanation. In neutral communication, responsibility is shared. One person asks, the other answers, and clarity is the goal. But in interrogative dominance loops, something subtle shifts. The questioner retains the right to remain satisfied or dissatisfied, while the responder becomes responsible for eliminating all ambiguity. This creates what social psychologists call epistemic asymmetry. One person controls the standard of enough. A simple example, you were late, you respond, traffic was heavy, then comes, but you knew there would be traffic, right? Now you are no longer explaining lateness. You are defending foresight, decision-making, and character. The critical shift is not in content, but in standard setting. Whoever defines sufficient explanation controls the interaction. Detection tool. If you notice that each answer does not resolve the question, but instead generates a new requirement for justification, you are inside a burden shift structure. This is the first layer, the quiet relocation of responsibility from questioner to speaker. And once that relocation occurs, escalation becomes effortless. Once burden shifts, the next stage is refinement pressure. Your explanation is not rejected outright, it is dissected for precision gaps. You said traffic's, what route exactly? You said busy, how busy? You didn't mention time, what time did you leave? This is not curiosity, it is granular extraction. Cognitive load research shows that humans, when placed under sustained specificity pressure, begin to lose confidence in their own memory accuracy. Even correct answers start to feel unstable when repeatedly fragmented. Precision escalation is effective not because it reveals truth, but because it destabilizes certainty. Over time, the responder begins to preemptively over-explain, trying to close every possible interpretive gap before it is even opened. That is the trap. You are no longer answering questions. You are attempting to prevent future questioning, and that shifts the entire mental posture from communication to defense. This is where the loop deepens. Not all questioners trigger over-explanation equally. Some individuals produce it automatically, even before they speak. The reason lies in perceived status. When a person is seen as competent, analytical, or socially dominant, their confusion is interpreted as meaningful, their silence feels like judgment, their questions feel like tests rather than inquiries. This is closely related to Milgram's findings on authority obedience, not in behavior, but in cognition. People adjust internal certainty when they feel evaluated by higher status observers. In everyday interaction, this manifests subtly: a raised eyebrow, a pause before responding, a neutral "are you sure?" Suddenly, your confidence weakens, not because the content changed, but because the social frame did. Doubt is not always self-generated. It is often socially induced through perceived evaluative pressure. Detection tool. If you find yourself revising your answer not because of new information but because of the listener's reaction, status-encoded doubt is active. This layer is crucial because it explains why intelligent people are not immune. Intelligence does not protect against social calibration pressure. It often increases sensitivity to it. And yet, even this is not the deepest layer. At this stage, the interaction subtly flips roles. Instead of the questioner clarifying intent, the speaker is now responsible for repairing ambiguity that the questioner introduced. This is where Darvo-like structures can appear in everyday communication patterns, not as overt denial, but as responsibility displacement through questioning. Example pattern: you didn't communicate this properly. When exactly did you say it? So you're admitting you were unclear. Notice what has happened. The focus has shifted from shared understanding to your performance as a communicator. You are now defending clarity itself. Accountability inversion is successful when the questioner never has to state their own interpretive framework, only critique yours. This creates a psychological imbalance. The responder continuously refines while the questioner remains structurally unexamined. The longer this continues, the more the responder begins to internalize the idea that clarity is their burden alone, and that leads directly into the next layer, the most psychologically persistent one. After repeated exposure, the external loop becomes internal behavior. You start answering simple questions with excessive context before it is requested. You anticipate skepticism that has not yet been expressed. You begin to pre-defend your statements. This is the internalization phase. Social psychologists describe this as anticipatory impression management, but in its deeper form, it becomes cognitive self-surveillance. The mind begins running silent simulations. How might this be misunderstood? What will they ask next? What am I failing to justify right now? The result is not communication, it is preemptive defense construction. Once internalized, the interrogative loop no longer requires another person. You become both questioner and responder simultaneously. At this point, even neutral environments feel evaluative. Even supportive people can trigger over-explanation, and this is where a counterintuitive finding emerges. But here is where it becomes more complex. Not all interrogative pressure comes from dominance or control. Some of it comes from uncertainty intolerance, individuals who ask excessive follow-up questions, not to assert superiority, but to reduce their own ambiguity discomfort. Research in uncertainty management theory shows that some people experience cognitive discomfort when information is incomplete. They interrogate not to dominate, but to stabilize their internal sense of coherence. The same behavioral pattern, repeated questioning, can emerge from opposite psychological motivations, control in one case, anxiety in another. This is why misreading intent is so common. A person making you over-explain may not be exerting power, they may simply be unable to tolerate gaps in understanding. However, the effect on you remains identical. Your cognitive system does not distinguish intent easily. It responds to structure, and the structure is still: explain more, justify more, stabilize uncertainty that is no longer yours alone. If these patterns are widespread, if burden shifts, precision escalation, status-encoded doubt, and accountability inversion emerge across contexts, then what does that reveal about human communication itself? It suggests that explanation is rarely neutral. It is often negotiated territory. People are not only exchanging information, they are negotiating how much justification each piece of information requires. In that sense, conversations are not just about truth, they are about control over interpretive space. And this raises a more uncomfortable observation. You are not only subject to this pattern, you also participate in it. Every time you ask someone, "Are you sure?" Every time you request clarification that could have been accepted as sufficient, every time you unconsciously raise the bar for what counts as an adequate answer, you are shaping the same loop from the other side. The unsettling realization is not that some people make you over-explain. It is that human dialogue naturally drifts towards structures where explanation is continuously pressured beyond necessity unless consciously restrained, and most people never notice the drift. Now that the mechanism is visible, its influence becomes interruptible. 3 tools matter here. First, the explanation boundary rule. Answer once cleanly, without expansion. If clarification is needed, allow the other person to request it. Do not pre-fill interpretive gaps that have not been stated. Second, the question audit. When faced with repeated questioning, silently categorize it. Is this clarifying meaning, or is it extracting justification? Only the first deserves expansion. The second requires boundary, not detail. Third, the density principle of communication. A complete answer is not the one with the most information, but the one that directly resolves the question posed. Anything beyond that is optional, not obligatory. Precision is not the same as over-elaboration. Clarity often decreases when explanation increases beyond necessity. And finally, a reframing that consolidates everything. Not every question deserves a deeper answer. Some only demand a confident one. Because once you understand how easily explanation becomes extraction, you stop confusing verbosity with truth. The next layer of this subject is not about why people question, but about why some questions feel impossible to answer cleanly even when you are right.